My sister asked my question. She starts.
All right. So today we are going to talk about the evolution of religion. And so you might start by asking, why are we talking about the evolution of religion in this class that's supposed to be about the evolution of cooperation? And so at the most sort of macro level, I feel like there's this similarity in that, like altruism and pro-sociality, religion is a topic that has sort of often been seen as outside the realm of things that you can study, with the sort of through the lens of science and scientific inquiry. And so some of what this class is about is showing how you can actually use a lot of the sort of scientific tools to think about these kinds of questions. But also more specifically, as exemplified by this picture, which was from the first slide of the first lecture of class, the Good Samaritan, there's this very long-standing link between religion and pro-sociality, in that many of the tenets of religion involve moral, ethical, and pro-social behavior. So, a lot of what we're going to talk about in terms of explanations for the evolution of religion have to do with cooperation. And finally, religion is itself an evolutionary puzzle very similar to the puzzle of cooperation, in that a lot of religious belief and religious practice involves human behaviors that are costly. So things like, spending time and effort on prayer, which is then comes with an opportunity cost, and we could be doing other sort of fitness-enhancing behaviors during that time. A lot of rituals, again, involve an investment of time, and a lot of rituals involve the actual material sacrifice in one form or another. And also, a lot of religious traditions come with various behavioral restrictions, many of which are also sort of fitness reducing in some sense. And so, if when you look at it from this perspective, it makes religious belief and practice seem maladaptive, and so it raises this question of why should natural selection have preserved this, given what seems to be costly. And I think it's probably not controversial that selection has preserved religious belief, but just as a few statistics to support the claim that religious belief is alive and well. Here is a survey from Gallup of the fraction of people saying that religion is very important or fairly important in their life as Americans over the last 50-ish years. And although there's been a small increase in the fraction of people saying not very important, even in the U.S., there still is overwhelming majority of people saying that religion is fairly or very important in their lives. This is another one that slices it by sort of age cohort and then also year. And so with the millennials are apparently defined as people born after 2002 or whatever they are. They basically don't only start showing up once you're in that cohort, but the point is, even for people that are old or young, basically everywhere, above 80% of people have never doubted the existence of God in the U.S., except for millennials who seem like a little bit of a change in this trend, with things really kind of falling fairly precipitously there. But be that as it may, there's still, you see an overwhelming fraction of Americans who've never even doubted the existence of God, at least in certain instances. And then sort of internationally, here's just a sort of slice of the way people, what religious groups people identify with around the world. And you see that only 16% of people report being unaffiliated, and this unaffiliated doesn't even necessarily mean non-religious in a believing sense. A lot of these people could, I think, are believe in God in one way or another that's just non-denominational. So, this is just sort of a smattering of fun facts about prevalence of religious belief, but I think it's pretty safe to say that religious belief and religious practice is a totally central feature of the modern world, and was, if anything, much more central in sort of earlier epochs, sort of pre-Enlightenment, when there wasn't really another game in town as for a sort of model of understanding the world. So, in terms of the question I want to explain is, why is it that that religion and sort of religious belief seems so ubiquitous, essentially, despite the fact that it seems to have these costs associated with it? And broadly, there's two classes of explanations for the evolution of religion that we're going to talk about. The first are what are called functionalist explanations, and so these explanations are along the lines of the mechanisms for evolution of cooperation, type mechanisms for cooperation. That is to say, these are explanations that basically argue that in one way or another, despite what's the sort of short-run costs of engaging some of these sort of religious practices or maintaining some of these religious beliefs, there are long-run benefits that are created by those costs, and so it makes selection directly favor religious belief. In the same way that all these mechanisms of cooperation make selection directly favor cooperative behavior. Then the other class of explanations are the sort of like byproduct explanations, and these theories argue that rather than religion being ubiquitous because it's actually adaptive, it argue that religion is ubiquitous despite the fact that it's actually not adaptive, it's functionally irrelevant, or in fact maybe even maladaptive. And the reason that it's ubiquitous is that there are various low-level cognitive, like features of human cognition, which are themselves adaptive for reasons not having to do with religious belief, but who, as a byproduct, give rise to belief. And so what we're going to do in this lecture is we're going to unpack each of these sort of different explanations and talk about some of the evidence for them in a lot of detail. And as has been the case for various other things that we've discussed in this class, it's not like we're going to come out at the end and we say, okay, well, it turns out actually it's the byproduct explanation is the right answer. This is something where there's a lot of ongoing debate in the field, and these people fighting with these people, and then other people trying to reconcile them and come up with new syntheses of both of them. And so often it has a flavor of this sort of pig pile situation. And that, for anyone that is interested, is Yarrow Dunham's daughter, who's the professor for Psych 101. And she's like substantially younger than them, but like the same size as them, and just like jump right in the pig pile. It's like, yeah, let's do it. Okay, so this is sort of like what is happening in this evolution of religion field, not quite as intensely as the group selection versus kin selection people, but up there, because as you will see, that a lot of this group selection debate spills over into the religion debate. Okay, so in terms of functionalist explanations, there are various flavors of them. But the one that I think is the most widespread and also that is most directly relevant to this class is built around the fact that morality and moral and ethical behavior is central to most religious traditions. And most of the sort of what they call the world religions have as a feature one or more gods that observes what people are doing and rewards good behavior, that is cooperation, and punishes bad behavior or selfishness. And, well, at least when you're interacting with other co-religionists, some of the religions are less upset about defection towards out-group members or towards members of other religions, but at least sort of within group, fairly universally, religious traditions stipulate that you should, not take advantage of other people. And so this is what I sort of deemed divine reciprocity. So it's like, rather than direct reciprocity or indirect reciprocity, where the people that you're interacting with or other people that are observing you reciprocate your behavior, here it's the divine forces reciprocate your behavior. And this is way more powerful than any kind of more human implemented reciprocity, if you believe in it, because God is always watching. And so even in one-shot anonymous interactions, still the divine forces know what you're doing and are keeping an eye on you. So there's never such a thing as a time when you're off the hook and can get away with being selfish. And so the functionalist explanations basically argue that because of this sort of divine reciprocity and the sense that you're being watched and therefore you should be pro-social if you believe in God, belief leads to increased cooperation. And for one reason or another, this increased cooperation is then favored by selection. And there's a couple of different arguments that are made about why this would be, but before we can even get to the point of being like, okay, well, why would increased cooperation, be favored by selection? There's a first order question of, is there actually an association between religious belief and cooperation? That is, does religious belief actually make you more cooperative? And so there are about 10,000 studies on this topic, but essentially all of them are kind of a mess in that they use data that is not satisfying in one way or the other. So a lot of studies use self-report altruism, like how much money do you donate to charity or something like that. And self-report measures of this stuff are really terrible because there's all this incentive to say you do nice things even if you don't. So like that's a mess. Another thing looks at charitable donations, but it's very often charitable donations to religious organizations, which again is complicated because if you're sort of donating to your own church, that's not like a sort of pure public good. That's something that you directly get benefit from. It's like when rich people donate to the opera, it's like, well, it's kind of pro-social, but like, and then another problem is that, and I guess a related problem is that you don't really know in those situations how much it's how much is actually happening, and B, to the extent that it's strategic versus really pro-social. And so we wanted to know, is religious belief actually associated with more cooperation? And so having run a whole lot of experiments in which we have people make actual incentivized economic game decisions with total strangers, we realized we have a lot of data on people's prosociality, and we included in the demographic questionnaire at the end of most of the studies that we ran this question: how strongly do you believe in the existence of a god or gods? And so we have a data set to answer this in a, what at least to me is a more satisfying way, with this real sort of pro-social behavior towards another person. And so what I'm going to show you is the result of over 14,000 people recruited over a whole bunch of different studies from all around the country. Actually, some of these may also be international, over a period of years. And so this is just the distribution of responses to this question of how strongly do you believe in the existence of God or gods, from very little down here to very much down here. It's just like a 7-point Likert scale. And what you see is this massively bimodal distribution, which is sort of interesting in and of itself. And suggests that, by and large, belief is kind of like a binary thing, like you believe or you don't believe. And there's not that many people that are like, yeah, I don't know, like I'm indifferent, maybe I believe, maybe I don't believe, 4 out of 7. It's like kind of weird. So anyways, this is just to say that's the structure of belief, but now we can ask for each of these different levels of belief, what was the average amount that people gave in a dictator game. As remember, this is just unilateral money division with a total stranger. And what you see is that there is a very statistically significant positive correlation where the more people believe in God, the more pro-social they are. And this is robust to controlling for a ton of stuff: age, gender, education, income, politics, and also just baseline trust in others, which is something that you might imagine to sort of mediate this relationship. And the effect size is actually pretty big, in that it's going from like an average of 28% to an average of 35% or something like that. It doesn't like necessarily sound huge, although if you want to say percent increase, that's like probably like an increase of a quarter or a third or something like that. But if you break down the actual distribution, So now what I'm going to show you is I'm just going to compare the people that said that they were strong atheists versus the people that said they were strong believers. And I'm going to show you for each of these two different sort of sets of belief, what was the distribution of donation amounts in the dictator game. So down here were the people that kept that gave nothing and kept everything, and here are the people that gave everything away, which is weird, and these are the people with the 50-50 split. And what you see is that in both cases, most people were either giving nothing or giving half. And there was this little chunk down here giving everything, sort of being hyper-altruistic. But if you compare the believers to the atheists, you see that the atheists are about 50% more likely to give nothing than the believers, and the believers are about twice as likely to be hyper-altruistic. So it's like it's a meaningful effect size. So this is evidence that there is indeed a correlation between belief and prosociality. But as you know, I hope you guys all have heard at least a couple of times, correlation doesn't imply causation, and so there are these nice experiments trying to show a causal link between sort of at least thinking about God and prosociality. And so what they do is they do this sentence unscrambling task where they give you 5 words, and the idea is you're supposed to throw 4 of them out and then rearrange them to make a sentence. So in this one, you would throw out eradicate, and it would be she felt the spirit. It would be a sort of correct solution to this unscrambling task. And so they give 3 different conditions. In the neutral condition, they just do 10 neutral sentences that don't have anything to do with anything. In this sort of secular condition, they do sentences that involve sort of secular institutions that do monitoring and sort of incentivizing of good behavior. And then in the God condition, they did a bunch of words related to religion and belief. And again, this was done, I think this was done in Canada actually, but it was done with predominantly Christians. It's just for what it's worth in terms of the specific words that they're picking and stuff. And then after doing these, one of these 3 sentence unscrambling tasks, they play a dictator game. And so what you're going to see is a fraction of money that people give away in the dictator game as in each of the 3 conditions. And so in the neutral condition, you see it's about 50-50 between half the people are giving nothing and half the people are giving half. In the secular prime condition, you get a big shift where a large majority of people are giving half. So that's thinking about institutions, sort of secular institutions that incentivize good behavior leads to good behavior. But you see that the same thing is true about the religious concepts. And as you can see in this experiment, there's only 25 people in each condition, so it's a tiny experiment and the kind of experiment that these days we would a little bit poo-poo. To be like, oh, come on, you're not going to learn anything from 25 people. But they've subsequently done a big meta-analysis of a lot of studies of these flavors, and it supports the basic idea that inducing people to think about God makes them more pro-social. So it seems like there is support for this core piece of the functionalist account of religion, which is that religion does make people more pro-social. And so now the question is, okay, fine, so why would that be adaptive? And there's 2 different stories. The simplest story is just group selection. So if religion makes people be more cooperative in one-shot anonymous situations where normally strategic reasoning would say be selfish, but if they think God is watching, then it makes them be pro-social, that binds them to cooperating when they don't have to. So if you were a non-believer, you could get away with defecting and therefore earn a higher payoff, which would give you an advantage over the religious people. But the groups of believers would be more cooperative than the groups of non-believers, and therefore group selection could cause the religious groups to outcompete the non-religious groups because the religious groups were all cooperating with each other because they thought God was watching them and keeping them in line. And so by this story, the adaptive logic is just this totally standard group selection stuff that we talked about earlier, and here it's just like religion is a proximate implementation that like leads to this behavior that then is ultimately favored through group selection. So that's fine, but that account relies on group selection and has all the sort of caveats that go with. Remember, that was the last time I showed the fighting pictures of the kids, was when we were talking about the group selection thing. Everybody loves to fight about whether group selection is a good explanation for things or not. So if you like group selection, then fine. This is a fine explanation. The other story is costly signaling. Which, remember, we talked about the idea with the costly signaling is that if there's these signals that are, differentially costly for low versus high quality types, such that it's only worth it for the high quality type to send the signal, then the signal is not a signal, like the peacock's tail kind of thing. And so the idea here would be that, so religious belief makes you more trustworthy because, God is watching you and keeping you in line. And people want to interact with trustworthy others. So if you can credibly signal that you're a believer, then people will be more likely to trust you and be more likely to interact with you, which will be individually beneficial. But the problem is you need the signal to be, you need a way to credibly signal belief, and that's why you have all these costly rituals and practices. Is there ways that make it costly, that make belief costly, and therefore make it so that only believers will do it, and then it will make the signal credible. And the idea being that remember though, in order for costly signaling to work, it's not just that the thing is costly, but it has to be differentially costly for the sort of trustworthy versus non-trustworthy types. And so the way that logic would work here is you would have to say that the rituals are costly. So, if you don't believe in God, it's not worth doing the rituals, even though you get some trust, even though people trust you more, you have to spend all your time doing these rituals. But if you actually believe in God, then the rituals don't seem nearly as costly because you think you're going to get some future reward, and so it's worth it for the believers to do the rituals and get the trust benefits. It's not worth it for the non-believers to do the rituals, and so you get this sort of separating equilibrium. So there's a problem with that logic, which I'm going to come back to in a minute. But before we deconstruct the logic, there's also just an empirical question of, is there evidence that there is signaling value in sort of rituals? And there's this cool study by Rich Sosis, who is he's an anthropologist, I think he's at UConn, that is associated with most associated with this costly signaling theory. And so what he did is he looked at 19th century utopian communes, of which apparently there was like this big commune movement that popped up in the US in the 19th century. And all these communes got established, and then after a while they all died out because it's hard to have a commune. And by died out, I mean literally people died, but they gave up on the commune and went back to regular life. And what he did, and a key feature is that a lot of the communes were religious, and a lot of them were not religious. And so he wanted to see is like, how long did the communes last? And then he wanted to see it as a function of how many costly requirements did they have for being part of the commune. And so this is things like, you can have requirements or constraints on coffee, alcohol, tobacco, meat, owning photographs, types of clothing, hairstyle, jewelry, marriage, sex or celibacy, like child ownership, fasting, whatever, mutual criticism, knowledge, all different kinds of things where basically in order to join the commune, you have to agree to abide by some of these essentially costly restrictions. And so now what he shows is the average number of years that the commune lasted as a function of the number of these costly requirements broken down by whether it's a religious commune or a secular commune. And what you see is that for the secular communes, the number of rituals didn't really make very much, or the number of requirements didn't make that much difference. But for the religious communes, there's this really quite striking relationship where the more costly requirements there were, the more long-lasting the commune was. And so he says, so look, this is evidence of costly signaling because, something. But this is not about anything to do with costly signaling in the way that we usually talk about it, because what this is just about a selection criteria, like a gatekeeping thing. Rather than saying, okay, we've got this group of people, I'm trying to figure out who's trustworthy and who's not trustworthy, and I'm using these behaviors as some way to infer something. This is just about being you have to be super committed in order to join in the first place. And so if you can do a sorting at the outset to say we're only going to let people into the commune that really desperately want to be in the commune and so are willing to take on all these super costly behaviors, then that allows the commune to have a greater chance of succeeding in the future because you're able to screen at the outset for only people that are really committed. That's, I don't know that this really has that much to do with peacocks, but it's cool. But even if you say that there was some kind of signaling thing that is just in the sort of basic costly signaling theory, there's a problem, which is, as we were just saying, costly signaling, in order for it to work, sending the signal has to be less costly or more beneficial for the high quality type. But in order for, so this means, as I was saying before, that the rituals have to be more beneficial for the believers than the non-believers, or less net costly, such that it's worth doing the rituals for the believers, it's not worth it for the non-believers, and the sort of obvious reason that this would be true is that the believers believe that there's some sort of otherworldly, post-death reward that they're going to get for engaging in these behaviors, and so that makes it seem worth it to them and makes them do it, and so on. But if we're going to try and tell a story about natural selection, then it needs to be that there's some actual material benefits to believing that are differential between the two. Because if you have the situation where, in terms of actual material benefits, the cost of the rituals outweigh the benefit of being trusted, then in terms of actual material fitness, it's just no matter whether you believe that there's some other life waiting for you or not, it's going to reduce your this world fitness to engage in behavior, and so that means that the people that believe and then do the behaviors and then they get trusted, they're going to actually be materially worse off for having done it, and so it's not going to be favored by selection. And conversely, if the benefit of being trusted, the sort of material benefit of being trusted outweighs the cost of the rituals in actual material terms, then it doesn't matter whether you actually believe or not. Everyone should do the rituals in order to get the benefits. So either way, the signal falls apart. And so it's my opinion that the costly signaling accounts of religious belief don't make any sense and are sort of there's some not thinking carefully about what costly signaling actually involves, which is kind of shocking given how widespread these theories are, but as far as I can tell, it doesn't actually make any sense. So to summarize these functionalist accounts, the idea is that religious belief induces one-shot cooperation by making you think that God is watching you, and so group selection can straightforwardly promote religious belief as a way to get people to cooperate, and costly rituals can signal commitment, but that only really works not for this sort of standard costly signaling kind of thing, but more as a gatekeeping effort where in order to join the group, you have to be willing to to invest in the cost of engaging in these rituals. And this whole thing can work if the actual material benefit for being in a group differs across people. And so then having these costly rituals works as a sorting filter that basically says only people that really want to be in the group and therefore are going to be willing to contribute to the group can join the group. Okay, so that's all the religion is actually adaptive line of reasoning. And now we've got the byproduct line of reasoning. And so here the idea is that there are various low-level features of human cognition that form the building blocks for religious belief and sort of lead people to believe in God, and that these cognitive features are adaptive for things not having to do with religious belief, just for like, being successful in life, and therefore selection maintains these cognitive features as part of human psychology. And that causes religion to then arise as a byproduct because everybody is carrying around this cognitive machinery because it's useful for other stuff. It leads to people believing in God. And so then even if religion is actually maladaptive, so religious belief is reducing your fitness, that means, and that would mean that having these cognitive features comes with a cost, because it leads you to have these religious beliefs that then lead you to engage in this costly behavior. Still, the whole thing can be favored by selection if the other benefits you get from the cognitive features outweigh the sort of cost of religion. So to make this more tangible, I'm going to walk through a few of these different potential low-level cognitive mechanisms that have sort of been linked to religious belief. Okay, so one of them is our ability and tendency to recognize other minds, that is to have theory of mind, to sort of be able to say, I can like look at what you're doing and simulate your mind and make some inferences about what you're intending and what you're thinking and what you know and so on. It's like a super crucial ability of humans for social life in order to like figure out what other people are going to do and behave accordingly. But the fact that we're always looking around and trying to like exercise theory of mind and figure out what other people are thinking can be over-applied such that you wind up anthropomorphizing non-human things and attributing theory of mind to agents that don't actually have minds, and similarly attributing intentionality to things that are not intentional, like you see a lightning bolt hit a tree and set it on fire, and you then say, oh well, must have been some intention behind that, like why did that happen? If you're always looking around for intentionality. And so those things can predispose you to see sort of like, the hand of God at work in the world around you. And so that is a potentially maladaptive consequence of this kind of heuristic. But the thing is, like, not only is having theory of mind in general useful, but even the tendency to overgeneralize and to attribute intentionality to non-intentional agents is overall probably a good strategy, because it's like a better safe than sorry type thing, which is like, if you think that something's intentional and it turns out actually not to be, usually it's not that big of a deal. Whereas if you think something's not intentional, but then it turns out that actually it is, that can really screw you over. And so there's this idea of hyperactive agent detection. And we say, if you're going to err in one direction, better to err in the direction of assuming that things are intentional agents. Okay, another big one is the tendency to infer causal relationships from observed statistical relationships. That is to say, a major challenge in our life is figuring out what causes what. And in general, people are not out running randomized controlled trials all the time. And instead, what we do is we basically just see patterns. We observe things happening in the world, and then we have to draw inferences about causality. And in general, it's a pretty good rule of thumb that if one thing happens, then another thing happens right afterwards. Like probably the first thing had something to do with with causing the second thing. And so, in general, that's a good rule of thumb. But as we just were mentioning earlier, it's not actually true that seeing two things being correlated in time or sort of co-occurring means that they're causally linked. And so the tendency to infer causation from things happening one after the other can lead to what's called magical thinking, where you believe that causation exists where there isn't actually any. Like, you do some ritual, and then right afterwards a good thing happens, and then you sort of infer, oh, hey, that ritual must have caused that thing to happen. And then also there's sort of selective memory where, say, you do the ritual, 10 times, and once or twice it so happens that a good thing happens afterwards. Like, those ones are super salient, and you remember them, and you kind of discount all the times that you did the ritual and nothing happened. And so you can sort of tend to establish this link, this causal link, even if there isn't actually one. And the third one is mind-body dualism. That is the belief that there are physical entities and there are psychological entities that are separate classes of entities, and they function differently. That is to say that the mind is not just part of the body, but exists as a sort of fundamentally different type of entity. And that's often quite useful in terms of our sort of just like basic simplifying the way we think about things. If we can sort of model psychology, we're not, saying, oh, well, actually there's neurons underneath and I know the pattern of neurons and something about action potentials or whatever. Like, that doesn't happen, right? Nobody does that. You have this model of like, oh, well, I know what, how people act, how people think, and that's, whatever, it's something how they act. But tending to think of the mind and the body as separate lays the framework for basically all of the world religions that have this sort of tenet of the spirit or the soul as a separate thing from the body. And so to the extent that you are engaging in mind-body dualism for useful everyday decision-making, that predisposes you towards believing these features of religion. And so the commonality across all three of these different mechanisms is that each of the mechanisms is typically useful. It tends to help you make correct inferences and correct decisions, and so that's why it's sort of maintained by selection that we should have these sort of cognitive shortcuts. But you can then, that is, most of the time they're useful, but sometimes they're sort of, they lead you astray. And this kind of overgeneralization leads you to apply, sort of infer intentionality where there isn't any, for example. And given that overgeneralization typically occurs via the intuitive processes, sort of as we were talking about a few lectures ago with this ease-flexibility trade-off thing, if the idea of intuitive responses is they're easy but inflexible, that inflexible part means they lead to overgeneralization. So if you're sort of not thinking carefully about it and you're just relying on the sort of automatic responses, you kind of assume everything is intentional. And then if you stop and think about it, you can be like, oh, well, wait a minute, in this situation, that was just a lightning bolt out of the sky. Probably there wasn't really any intentionality behind that. And so, oh man, this is really going off the bottom here, sorry. It says, the byproduct account therefore predicts that intuitive thinking will support religious belief, whereas sort of more rational analytic thinking will undermine belief, because the more deliberative you are, the more likely you are to say in any of these given situations, well, wait, does that sort of, is there actually intentionality going on there? Like, is there actually a causal relationship? And when you stop and think, you'll realize sometimes the answer is, well, probably not, and then that will undermine belief. So the question is that actually true? And there are various different papers that have showed this, but we had the first such paper where we asked them just that, like, how much do you believe in God? But we also asked them this question. We think it's a little bit, it's more like really direct. Do you agree with the statement that I've had an experience that convinced me that God existed? And so we're going to see the answer to that. Answer that question as a function of how deliberative the people are. Remember, this is this cognitive reflection test that we talked about a few lectures ago. This thing about the bat and the ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? The answer is not 10 cents, but it seems like it is. And so these down here are the people that gave that sort of wrong intuitive answer for all three questions. These are the people that didn't give any of the intuitive answers. And what you see is that the more intuitive answers the person gave, the more likely they were to say that they believed in God. And this was one study with a few hundred people. Oh yeah, it's all you can control for everything in the world, essentially, that you want, and if this relationship is robust. And there's also been a big meta-analysis of like 1 million studies showing the same thing. So this is a very clear, robust correlation. But there could be two different interpretations of this. One is the interpretation that the byproduct hypothesis makes, which is if you are a more deliberative person, then you are less likely to believe in God because you're more likely to reject things that are usually taken as pieces of evidence for belief. But the other possibility is it could just be that if you're raised in a religious household, that sort of teaches you for one reason or another not to be deliberative, and so the direction of causality could actually be the opposite. It's not that the cognitive style is causing belief, but it's sort of having belief is affecting your cognitive style. And so to try and present evidence that that's not what's going on, we also ask people, how much has your belief in God changed since childhood? And where here sort of 5 is the midpoint of the scale. So people up here have sort of increased in belief since childhood, and people down here have sort of decreased in belief since childhood. And so this is trying to get at this change element, like how people revise their beliefs. And what you see is that the highly deliberative people have tended to become more atheist over the course of their life, whereas the people that are more intuitive have tended to become more believing over the course of their life. So this supports the idea that there really is a causal link to the amount that you're deliberating affecting how you revise your beliefs. We also found that CRT was not particularly correlated with how religious your family was when you were being raised. So that is, evidence in support of this link. Again, it's correlational. Then there's also some causal evidence. So we did this experiment where we asked people basically to write about a time that either they used intuition or they used careful reasoning, either it worked out poorly or it worked out well, with the idea being that if you wrote about a time that intuition was good or that reflection was bad, that should make you rely more on intuition. If you wrote about a time that intuition was bad or reflection was good, that should lead you to rely more on sort of deliberation. And so we had people, write a paragraph about one of these times, sort of inducing sort of a more intuitive or a more deliberative mindset. And then we had them say, how much do you believe in God, 1 to 10, and then also how much do you agree with the statement, I've had an experience that convinced me of the existence of God. And what we found was for both measures, as predicted, the two conditions that made people more intuitive, they reported stronger belief in God and a higher likelihood of having a sort of revelatory experience compared to the people that were induced to be more deliberative. So even in this super short run sort of lab setting, you can push people's answers around on these questions by inducing them to be more intuitive or more deliberative. And I have to say, we were surprised that this worked. I proposed to my co-authors that we should try this, and they're like, dude, there's no way that that's going to work. You can't push around people's belief in God. And I was like, all right, fine. So I ran some other experiment having to do with cooperation using this manipulation, and I just put the God question in at the end, and it worked. And I was like, look, it worked. Let's run it again with that as the main thing. And we did it again, and it worked. So we're like, all right, cool. Anyways, this is evidence in support of the sort of key pillar of the byproduct explanation, which is it is the case that intuitive processing is associated with greater belief. And so, now basically I've shown you empirical evidence that supports the underlying assumption of both of these different things. So religious belief is associated with more prosociality and sort of causes more prosociality, and intuitive processes also are associated with and cause belief in God. So maybe these things are both true. But if you think about it for a second, another thing that we spent a lot of time talking about is that intuitive processing is also associated with prosociality. And so it might be that this key link between religious belief and prosociality, which is the core of the functionalist account, whereby religious people are more prosocial and therefore favored by selection, it could actually be the case that that's not actually the result of anything functional, but it's just that this same intuitive mindset that makes you believe in God also leads you to be more prosocial. And so to test that, we looked at 2,300 people recruited from MTurk. We had them do the belief in God measure, the CRT, and the dictator game, and a dictator game. And so we replicated the result that people that believe in God more are more prosocial. And we also found that people that are more intuitive are more prosocial. And when you put those together into a model and you want to say, does belief in God explain giving above and beyond intuitiveness, we saw that this measure of intuitiveness accounted for a third of the relationship between belief in God and prosociality. So that's saying at least a big chunk of this association between religious belief and pro-sociality isn't actually anything causal of belief in God making you more pro-social, but it's just being intuitive induces both of those things to happen. But it could also be that, you know, both of these stories are true. There's also a real causal relationship between belief and pro-sociality. So this is a sort of like trying to put the two of them in conflict in like a horse race kind of thing. But there also have been efforts to try and reconcile them in some way. And so one version of this was called the big gods theory of Noren, Zion, and Henrich, where these anthropologists and psychologists, they were the people that did that weird thing that we talked about last class. They do a lot of cross-cultural stuff in small-scale societies and whatnot. And their suggestion is that sort of early proto-religion, which is the kind of things that you see in small-scale societies, it arose because of these cognitive byproducts that we've been talking about. But then some groups happened to, through a cultural evolutionary process, transition from proto-religions into actual, like, sort of big gods, moralistic religions, in which the gods, you know, aren't just like blasting trees with lightning for the hell of it, but like specifically are creating incentives to get people to cooperate. And then those groups did really well because they were able to cooperate more, and so those groups outcompeted the groups that were still stuck in proto-religion through cultural group selection. And so this is a like byproduct gets it started, and then group selection functionalist, kicks it off and makes it really be successful. One other potential, which is this theory that my student Nick Stagnaro came up with, and so this is the least well-established of any of these things, but I think it's a cool idea, is that, again, you could say the religious belief and maybe proto-belief developed through byproducts. You know, if you see the lightning striking a tree, you think, yeah, somebody's up there, okay, great. But then once a particular form of beliefs spreads within a group, then and a particular set of practices just kind of happens to arise because of byproducts, if you're in that group, there suddenly becomes individual level selection pressure for you to also believe that stuff and engage in those practices. Otherwise, members of your group are going to sanction you. Like if there comes, a belief in the group that everybody has to do a certain ritual in order to make it rain, if people see that you're not doing the ritual, they're going to get pissed at you because you're going to screw up the rain. And so then it becomes individually adaptive for you to believe. And in order to convince other people that you believe, it's useful to really actually believe it. And so that may in turn create selection pressure to not be that analytical, lest if you're always being too deliberative, you're not going to help yourself from questioning. And so this could help explain also some of the maintenance of why people are not more deliberative than they are, as it could be that there's this sort of individual level benefit to being not too deliberative, which is being able to sort of adopt the ideology and really sign on to the ideology of the groups in which you find yourself. Okay, so to summarize all of this, there is empirical evidence that religious belief is associated with cooperation, and evidence that it goes, at least to some extent, through this channel of thinking that God is watching you and therefore being pro-social. Religious belief is also associated with intuitive cognition, and as a result of each of these two things, it's argued that it may be that religion was adaptive because it relied on cooperation. It may also be that religion was a byproduct because of this kind of intuitive cognition, or it could be some combination of both. And the jury is still out. This is an exciting area of current research. And so I hope you guys have a great Thanksgiving. And when we come back from Thanksgiving, we'll talk about the uplifting topic of in-group bias and prejudice.